to the ITSM Practice Podcast.
Welcome to the ITSM Practice Podcast. Today we are talking about a topic that until recently lived mostly inside cybersecurity and software engineering circles. The Software Bill of Materials, or SBOM. But something important has changed. SBOMs are no longer just technical artifacts, they are becoming operational instruments of trust. And for managed service providers, this matters more than many leaders currently realize. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: if a critical software vulnerability was announced today, how quickly could your organization identify every customer-facing service that depends on it? For many providers, the answer is, I don't know. Most managed service providers still do not manage the dependency chain as an operational system. And that is becoming a problem. Not simply from a cybersecurity perspective, but from a governance, resilience, and competitive positioning perspective as well. When Log4Shell disrupted organizations globally, many providers discovered something alarming. They could not immediately determine where the vulnerable component actually exists across their services. Not because teams were incompetent, but because modern software ecosystems have become deeply interconnected and increasingly opaque. And SolarWinds reinforced a second lesson. Trusted vendors can themselves become systemic risk amplifiers. Together, those two events fundamentally change the software risk conversation. The issue was no longer just patching speed, it was visibility. Because organizations can only manage the risk they can actually see. And this challenge is becoming far more widespread than many leaders realize. According to recent industry research, approximately 65% of organizations experience at least one supply chain attack during the previous year. Let that number sink in for a moment. Nearly 2/3 of organizations have already encountered a compromise that originated somewhere within their software supply chain. Not necessarily through their own code, not necessarily through a misconfigured server, but through the dependencies, suppliers, libraries, platforms, and software ecosystems they rely on every day. And for many managed service providers, that visibility gap is becoming operationally dangerous because managing software dependencies across multiple customer services is no longer a security task. It is rapidly becoming an enterprise-wide operational program. At its core, an SBOM is relatively simple. It is a structured inventory of software components, libraries, dependencies, and versions inside an application or digital services. Think of it as an ingredient label for software. And the reason for this matters is surprisingly simple. Today, most organizations are not primarily running software they build themselves. Industry research consistently shows that 70 and 90% of modern applications consists of open source and third-party components rather than original code. In other words, the majority of the software supporting customer-facing services often originates outside the organization operating it, which means dependency chain visibility is no longer a technical convenience. It is an operational requirement. It tells you what exists inside the systems you operate and deliver. Now, on the surface, that sounds administrative, but operationally, it changes everything. Because you cannot govern a digital service you cannot fully describe. And today, most digital services are assembled rather than built from scratch. Modern applications rely heavily on open source components, third-party APIs, cloud-native services, proprietary modules, and deeply nested dependencies, which means managed service providers increasingly inherit risk rather than simply create it. And this is where many organizations still underestimate the scale of the challenge. Dependency chain management inside a managed service provider is not a side activity. Initially, it is almost a full-time operational program because it affects nearly every provided services. It impacts architecture decisions, vendor governance, service configuration management, change enablement, incident response, customer trust, and increasingly, commercial competitiveness. Over the next several years, enterprise customers will begin differentiating providers not only on service availability and support quality, but on transparency maturity. In other words, the ability to explain software composition and dependency exposure may become a competitive capability, not merely a security control. And organizations such as the United States CISA are accelerating this shift by emphasizing software transparency and supply chain visibility across the market. Now, despite this growing pressure, many organizations still approach SBOM incorrectly, and I consistently see three mistakes. The first is assuming vendors are secure. This remains one of the most persistent weaknesses in modern IT operations. Many organizations mentally outsource technology risk long before they operationally govern it. There is an implicit assumption that if software comes from a recognized vendor, then the supply chain risk has already been addressed somewhere upstream. But SolarWinds demonstrated the flaw in that thinking very clearly. Trust without transparency is optimism, and even commercial proprietary platforms frequently contains extensive open source dependencies underneath the surface, which means organizations often inherit hidden exposure from suppliers they have never directly assessed. A useful executive question today is remarkably simple. If your vendor cannot clearly explain the software components inside its platform, can it fully explain its operational risk posture? Increasingly sophisticated customers are beginning to ask exactly that. The second mistake is treating SBOMs as a one-time inventory exercise. organizations generate an SBOM during procurement, during an audit, or during a compliance initiative, and then store it in somewhere as a, let's say, static documentation. But software ecosystem evolves continuously. Dependencies change weekly. Libraries update constantly. New vulnerabilities emerge daily, which means that the static SBOMs lose operational value very quickly. An SBOM frozen in time becomes historical documentation, not operational intelligence. Many providers still approach SBOMs the same way organizations once years ago approached CMDB initiatives as inventory projects instead of living operational systems. But effective SBOM management must become continuous, integrated into CI/CD pipelines, connected into service configuration management, embedded into operational governance. Otherwise, visibility degrades faster than organizations realize. The third mistake is ignoring transitive dependencies. And this is where complexity becomes genuinely dangerous. Most organizations focus primarily on direct software components, but modern applications contains layers of indirect dependencies. Software inside software inside software. And during Log4Shell, many organizations discovered they were using vulnerable components they never knowingly installed in the first place. The most dangerous dependency is often the invisible one. Modern software environments are no longer linear. They are ecosystems. Applications depend on libraries. Libraries depend on other libraries. Cloud services depend on external platforms, and suppliers often depend on technologies that customers never directly see. Which means a vulnerability discovered in one component can rapidly create exposure across multiple services, suppliers, and customers. And that is precisely why visibility has become so important. Organizations cannot respond effectively to software supply chain threats they cannot see. The answer is not attempting to solve everything immediately. The answer is building maturity systemically. I generally think about SBOM adoption in 4 stages. The first stage is visibility. Before governance comes awareness. Organization must first identify critical applications, customer-facing services, strategic suppliers, and high-risk dependencies. This does not require perfection, but it does require commitment. Request SBOMs from strategic vendors. Map core service dependencies. Identify where third-party software creates operational concentration risk. That's very important. And this is not simply an internal governance exercise. Organizations such as US CISA, alongside multiple international cybersecurity initiatives, continue to push software transparency and supply chain visibility higher on executives' agendas. The direction of travel is increasingly clear. Customers, regulators, insurers, and are all beginning to expect greater supply chain accountability. Visibility is the foundation of operational trust. The second stage is governance. This is where visibility becomes policy. Who owns software supply chain oversight? How are suppliers evaluated? What standards define acceptable dependencies? How are software composition risks integrated into procurement and service onboarding? This is also where SBOM governance should connect directly into service configuration management practices, because software composition is now part of operational configuration integrity. The third stage is automation, and this is where organizations begin creating real operational leverage. Leading providers increasingly automate SBOM generation directly inside development and deployment pipelines. They integrate vulnerability intelligence feeds. They continuously monitor dependencies exposure. And they connect software composition insights directly into incident response processes. Because when the next major vulnerability emerges, and there will absolutely be another one, organizations will compete on response speed. The value of SBOMs emerges when they move from documentation into operational workflows. And finally, the fourth stage is continuous assurance. This is where software transparency becomes part of an organizational identity. Dependencies are monitored continuously. Suppliers are reassessed regularly. Customers gain greater visibility into operational governance maturity. And providers evolve from reactive security management toward continuous resilience management. I believe this is where the market is heading. The industry spent years optimizing infrastructure visibility. The next competitive battle will be software supply chain visibility. And the providers that operationalize that early will have a very different conversation with enterprise customers than the providers still treating SBOM as another compliance, beautiful Excel. Because ultimately, SBOM are not fundamentally about compliance. They are about reducing uncertainty inside increasingly complex digital ecosystems. In the past, organizations secured infrastructure. Today, they must also govern dependency chains. And that challenge is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Industry analysis regularly finds that more than 80% of modern code bases contain at least one known open source vulnerability. The question is no longer whether dependency risks exist. The question is whether organizations can identify and manage that risk before it becomes operational disruption. And for managed service providers, that changed the definition of operational trust entirely. Ask one strategic vendor a simple question. Can you provide a current SBOM for the services you deliver to us? The answer will likely tell you far more about your future operational exposure than any sales presentation ever will. Thank you for joining us on the ITSM Practice Podcast. And until next time, keep improving the way IT delivers resilience, transparency, and trust. I'm Luigi Ferri. Arrivederci.